My name is Hilda, and I am 60 years old. I never imagined that at this stage of my life, after raising children, teaching hundreds of young students, and building 4 decades of marriage with Henry I, would be sitting here telling the world how my own son tried to murder me. I have lived through betrayals I could never have imagined, and the scars I carry are deeper than the broken bones that still ache every time the rain falls. This is my story, one that begins with love and ends with a cliff. Just 3 days ago, Henry and I were standing at the edge of death, literally. My son Damien, the child I carried inside me for 9 months, the boy I cradled when he was sick, the teenager I defended against gossip, and the man I believed had built a respectable family, pushed his own parents off a 90-foot cliff. As I lay there in the gorge, my ribs fractured my lungs, struggling to hold air. I felt Henry's trembling hand squeeze mine. His whisper was hoarse, desperate. "Hilda, don't move. Play dead." That moment replayed again and again in my head. The son I trusted with my last heartbeat had decided we were worth more dead than alive. But the cruelty didn't end with the fall. What followed in the hours that passed as we lay broken at the bottom of the gorge was the unraveling of secrets Henry had carried in silence for 25 years. Secrets about Richard, my firstborn, the son I buried long ago, and Damien, the child I had poured my surviving love into. For decades, I had thought of my family as simple and beautiful. We lived in a modest suburban home filled with the sound of laughter and the smell of Henry's freshly carved oak furniture. I was a teacher, a profession that gave me purpose and a sense of pride. Every evening, I would come home with stories about my students, and Henry would tell me about the wood he had shaped that day. We had 2 boys, Richard, our golden child full of life and laughter, and Damien, quieter but no less loved. I thought I had given them both equal love. I thought I had done everything right. But life has a way of planting shadows in the corners of even the brightest homes. Richard was the soul of our family. He dreamed of studying engineering and building a future full of purpose. He was always beside Henry in the workshop, learning how to carve wood, always beside me in the kitchen, helping me carry heavy pots. When I laughed, Richard laughed louder. When I cried, Richard held me. He was my joy, my firstborn son. Damien was different. He was quiet, reserved, and often distant. But he had a way of looking at me that reminded me of my own father, so stern yet full of longing. I tried never to show favoritism, but in the quiet of night, I sometimes wondered if Damien could see how Richard's light filled every room, while his own presence remained in the shadows. I brushed those thoughts away, believing that love was enough to bridge any difference between siblings. And then 25 years ago, Richard died. They said it was an accident. He had fallen into the gorge at night, stumbled in the dark. I wore my black dress, held Damien's hand at the funeral, and thought my heart had been buried alongside my eldest son. I remember Damien's face, too calm, too still, while I screamed into the earth that swallowed Richard. I didn't question it then. Maybe I didn't want to, because to question the official story would mean questioning my family. After Richard's death, Damien changed. He became attentive, loving, always ready to help. He brought me tea when I looked tired, carried Henry's tools, and hugged me without needing a reason. I thought it was grief shaping him into a better man, but now I know it was something much darker, guilt carving a mask he would wear for decades. I never imagined that the same gorge where Richard's body had been found would one day be the place where Damien would try to end our lives too. 6 months ago, when Henry and I decided to update our will, the cracks began to show. Damien and his wife Melissa were suddenly too involved, suggesting lawyers, pushing for power of attorney, asking us to sell our home. Their words were coated in sweetness. "We just want what's best for you, Mom." But behind their smiles, I saw something I didn't want to name. When Melissa stroked my hand and whispered, "Now we're officially a united family forever," after we signed the will, I felt an inexplicable chill. Still, I convinced myself it was just my imagination. After all, how could a mother believe her son was capable of betrayal? But Henry knew. He had known for years. And on the night before Damien lured us to the mountains, Henry confessed the truth that shattered me more than any fall could. He told me what really happened to Richard 25 years ago. He told me what he had seen, what he had covered up, and why Damien's obsession with our finances was not born of love, but of desperation. And suddenly, I realized that my family had been built on lies buried deeper than any grave. Henry's confession cracked my world apart, even before Damien's hands pushed us toward the edge of that cliff. I remember the night so vividly, the way Henry sat at our kitchen table, his fingers trembling as they traced the rim of his coffee cup. His eyes, usually so steady, refused to meet mine. I thought he was hiding bad news about his health, or perhaps a financial burden he hadn't shared. But then he spoke Richard's name, and I felt the air shift around me. "Hilda," he whispered, "it wasn't an accident, Richard's fall." The cup slipped from my hands and shattered across the tiled floor. For 25 years, I had buried my grief under layers of forced smiles, Sunday church visits, and the belief that God had taken my boy too soon. To hear Henry suggest otherwise was like reopening a coffin with my bare hands. I begged him to explain, my voice breaking. And he did, every word etching itself into my skin like fire. He told me how on that night long ago, he had followed the boys to the gorge after hearing them argue. Richard had accused Damien of stealing money from Henry's workshop, money meant for Richard's college savings. Henry heard Damien shout back, full of rage and envy, that Richard always got everything, that he was tired of living in his brother's shadow. Then came a scuffle, the sound of footsteps sliding on loose gravel, and Richard's scream cut short by silence. Henry said when he reached the edge, he saw Damien standing there, frozen, staring down into the darkness where Richard had fallen. His face was pale, his body shaking, not with grief, but with shock at what he had done. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my fists pounding the table. My heart screamed for truth, for justice, for my child who had never come home. Henry's eyes filled with tears. "Because he was our only son left. And I thought if we buried the truth, maybe we could save him, maybe we could still have a family." Those words broke me. My husband, the man I trusted with my soul, had chosen silence over justice. He had forced me to grieve in ignorance while Damien grew up shielded by lies. And in that silence, Damien had learned the most dangerous lesson of all, that he could kill and still be protected. When Henry told me this, my body went cold. I didn't want to believe him. I told myself there had to be another explanation. But deep inside, I remembered Damien's strange calmness at the funeral, the way his hand had gripped mine too tightly, as if anchoring me to his secret. I remembered how he avoided Richard's friends afterward, how he suddenly became the perfect son. And I realized that Henry had been right all along. 2 days later, Damien invited us on a trip to the mountains. He said it would be good for us, a chance to clear our heads. He smiled like a dutiful son, and Melissa kissed my cheek, whispering how much she admired my strength. I wanted to believe them. I desperately wanted to believe I still had a son. But as we stood at the cliff's edge, looking down into the same gorge where Richard's body had once lain, I felt dread coil around my heart. And then it happened. Damien's hands were firm, deliberate, cruel. The shove came not with hesitation but with purpose. I saw the fury in his eyes, the coldness that no longer needed to hide. My body went weightless, the world spinning as I fell. Rocks tore at my skin, pain exploded through my chest, and then darkness. When I opened my eyes, Henry was beside me, bleeding, broken, but alive. His whisper still chills me. "Pretend we're dead, Hilda. Don't let him finish what he started." We lay there in the gorge, motionless, as Damien's shadow loomed above. I heard him speaking to Melissa on the phone, his voice calm, almost casual. "It's done," he said. "They won't bother us anymore." The words sliced through me deeper than the fall itself. My son, the boy I had nursed, the child I had sung to sleep, the man I had prayed for, was gone. In his place stood a stranger who had killed one brother and now tried to erase his parents for nothing more than greed. Hours passed. My ribs ached with every breath, my leg was twisted unnaturally, and Henry's face was pale with pain. Yet I clung to life not out of fear of death, but out of a burning need for truth. Damien thought he had silenced us, but I swore that night, lying in blood and dirt, that if I lived I would speak. When rescue came, it was by chance. A group of hikers spotted us at dawn, their shouts echoing through the gorge. As they scrambled down to reach us, I forced my eyes open, whispering through cracked lips, Help. Please. They carried us out, their faces horrified at the sight of our broken bodies. Paramedics rushed us to the hospital, and even as they strapped me to a stretcher, I clutched Henry's hand and said, "We will not be silent anymore." He nodded weakly, his eyes filled with the same determination. Because this time the world would know what our son had done. The hospital walls were white, too white, like snow that blinds you after staring too long. Machines beeped in rhythm with my battered heart, each sound reminding me I was still alive, though I wasn't sure if survival was a blessing or a curse. My body screamed with every movement, broken ribs, a fractured arm, bruises that painted me in purple and black. But nothing hurt more than the truth I carried inside me. The police came quickly. They asked questions in calm, measured voices as if my story were just another report to be filed. I told them everything about the shove, about the way Damien's eyes burned with hatred, about the phone call to Melissa. At first I thought they didn't believe me. One officer exchanged a look with another, doubt flickering across their faces. Perhaps they thought my injuries had muddled my memory, that grief had turned into paranoia. After all, what kind of son tries to kill his parents? But then Henry, weak and pale in the bed beside mine, lifted his head. His voice cracked, but the words were sharp. "She's telling the truth. Damien killed Richard 25 years ago. I saw it." The silence in that room was heavy. The officers leaned in their pens, frozen over notepads. Henry's confession unraveled years of lies, a hidden thread finally pulled loose. He told them everything, the fight between the brothers, the fall, the choice he made to cover for Damien. As he spoke, tears ran down my face. My husband had carried this burden alone for decades, and now the truth spilled out like blood that had been festering too long. The officers didn't write us off after that. They promised an investigation. They promised justice. But promises mean nothing when your soul is already cracked. Days blurred together in the hospital. Nurses came and went, adjusting IV lines, checking vitals. Sometimes I would wake in the night, convinced I saw Damien's silhouette standing at the door, watching, waiting to finish what he had started. My heart would pound until I realized it was only a shadow, a trick of my exhausted mind. Still, the fear never left. One evening, Melissa appeared. She walked into my room with a bouquet of lilies, her face painted with feigned concern. "Oh, Mom," she said sweetly, her voice dripping poison. "We were so worried." I could barely keep my rage contained. "You knew," I spat, my voice raw. "You were on the phone when he said it was done." Her smile didn't falter. "You're confused. Trauma does that to people." She placed the flowers on the table, leaning close enough for only me to hear. "No one will believe you. Damien is your son. You'll destroy yourself before you destroy him." My hand shook, but I reached for the nurse's call button. Melissa straightened her eyes, narrowing, and for the first time, I saw the mask slip. She wasn't here to comfort me. She was here to intimidate me into silence. The nurse entered, and Melissa quickly shifted back into her performance. "She's so fragile," she told the nurse, sighing dramatically. "I just want her to rest." When she finally left, I collapsed against my pillow, trembling. But her visit only fueled the fire inside me. They wanted me silent, helpless, broken, but I wasn't, not anymore. 2 weeks later, the police returned. They had recovered phone records, calls between Damien and Melissa, including one from the very night of the accident, and more financial documents showing Damien had already attempted to access our accounts after assuming we were dead. Greed had driven him just as it had driven him to take Richard's life all those years ago. The officers promised to bring Damien in for questioning. My heart twisted with both dread and hope. Part of me wanted him behind bars to pay for every scar, every sleepless night, every tear. But another part of me still saw him as the baby I once rocked to sleep, the boy whose small hand once clung to mine. Henry tried to comfort me. "You did everything you could as a mother," he said softly. "The choices Damien made, they are his alone." I wanted to believe him, but the guilt gnawed at me. Had I loved Richard more? Had Damien felt invisible? Had my blind trust in silence poisoned him into becoming the monster he now was? These questions circled my mind endlessly, leaving me no peace. The night before Damien's arrest, I dreamed of Richard. He stood at the edge of the gorge, sunlight streaming around him, his face calm, forgiving. He didn't speak, but his eyes told me what I needed to hear. "It wasn't your fault, Mom. It was his choice. I woke with tears on my cheeks, clutching Henry's hand. The next day, the police promised they would bring him in. My heart pounded with anticipation, fear, and something I hadn't felt in decades, the possibility of closure. But when the call came later that evening, it wasn't what I expected. Damien wasn't at his home. He wasn't at Melissa's parents' house either. He had vanished. When the officer's voice on the phone said the word vanished, I felt my stomach twist into knots. It was as though the walls of the hospital closed in around me, leaving no air to breathe. My son was out there wounded, pride cornered by truth and carrying the kind of rage that once pushed his brother into the gorge and his parents after him. If he had been dangerous before, what would he become now with everything exposed? Henry tried to calm me, though his own hands trembled as he gripped mine. "We'll be protected," he whispered. "The police know he's desperate. They'll find him." But nights in the hospital stretched long and merciless. Every shadow outside my window felt like Damien lurking every creak in the hallway, a reminder that unfinished business can stalk you more ruthlessly than death. Nurses told me to rest, but sleep never came easy. I was a mother torn in two, one son buried decades ago, another son lost to hatred and greed. 2 days later, Melissa was arrested. The police found evidence tying her directly to the planned text messages about the will searches on her phone about inheritance laws and how to declare a parent incompetent. She didn't break down in court. She didn't weep or plead. Instead, she smirked as they led her away, her eyes finding mine like daggers. That smirk told me what her lips didn't need to say: Damien will finish what we started. When I was discharged from the hospital, Henry and I didn't return to our house. The police insisted we stay elsewhere until Damien was caught. They moved us into a safe house, bland and colorless, with curtains always drawn. It was meant to shield us, but I felt like a prisoner. I longed for the creak of my old floorboards, the scent of Henry's wood shavings, even the hollow quiet left by Richard's absence. But more than anything, I longed for safety, for the feeling that my own blood wasn't hunting me. Each day, detectives updated us with little progress. Damien had emptied bank accounts, sold his car, and disappeared into the kind of shadows only desperation creates. His name lingered on the evening news, his photo beside the word fugitive. I would stare at that photo, his eyes so like mine, his jaw like Henry's, and wonder how love could curdle into something this monstrous. One night, Henry finally spoke the words I had been choking back. "If he comes for us again, we have to be ready." The thought made me shiver. Mothers aren't meant to prepare for war against their sons. But Damien had already declared war the moment he put his hands on us. Weeks blurred together. Melissa struck a deal with prosecutors, offering details in exchange for leniency. Through her testimony, we learned Damien had been plotting for years, building resentment like firewood waiting for a spark. Richard's death had been that first spark, and our silence had been the oxygen. Damien grew up believing lies could protect him, and lies could profit him. By the time Henry and I signed our updated will, Damien saw only one path forward: erase us, claim everything. Still, the day they finally caught him felt unreal. A call came in the middle of the night. Damien had been found 2 states away, hiding under a false name. He was in custody. Relief should have washed over me, but instead I felt hollow. My son was alive, yes, but in chains. The boy I once rocked to sleep had become the man the world would now call a murderer. At the trial, I sat in the courtroom, my body stiff, my hands twisted in my lap. Damien entered in an orange jumpsuit, shackled, yet still carrying himself with that defiant tilt of his chin. His eyes flicked toward me and Henry, and for a heartbeat I saw not hatred, but something colder: indifference. The prosecutor laid out every detail: the attempted murder at the gorge, the financial records, the testimony of Melissa. When they replayed the recording of his phone call saying, "It's done, they won't bother us anymore," the courtroom gasped. My chest burned, and Henry had to grip my hand to keep me upright. When Damien's lawyer tried to paint him as a man overwhelmed by stress, a son misunderstood, I nearly laughed. Stress doesn't push your brother into a gorge. Misunderstanding doesn't shove your parents toward their graves. As I sat there watching him, I realized something shattering. I didn't want vengeance. I didn't even want justice in the way the court would define it. What I wanted, what I would never have again, was my son. The little boy who once placed daisies in my apron pocket, who once whispered, "I love you, Mom," before bed. That boy was gone, replaced by the man before me. When the guilty verdict came, the room buzzed with whispers. Some people saw closure, others saw scandal. For me, it was something more complicated. A wound stitched shut, but still aching underneath. Because though the world would know Damien as a criminal, I would always know him as my son. And that truth was the heaviest burden of all. The day Damien was sentenced, the sky outside the courthouse was a dull, colorless gray. Crowds had gathered, journalists pressed against barricades, their cameras flashing like restless lightning. Henry and I walked slowly, my arm hooked through his for strength more than balance. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though grief had seeped into my bones. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with whispers. People wanted a spectacle, an ending to a story that had haunted the town for months. But for me, there was no ending that could heal what had been broken. When the judge entered and called the court to order, I sat rigid, my fingers twisting a handkerchief damp with tears I'd tried not to shed. Damien stood before us in shackles. His once crisp suits were replaced by the stark orange of prison garb. I searched his face for some trace of remorse, some flicker of the boy I once knew. But all I saw was a mask, cold and unyielding. The same mask he had worn after Richard's funeral, the same mask he had worn when he leaned over the cliff and whispered to Melissa that it was done. The prosecutor spoke with steady conviction, detailing the cruelty of Damien's actions, the years of deception, the greed that drove him to destroy his own family. Melissa's testimony was read aloud, her words cutting like glass. He said he had gotten away with Richard. He said he could get away with them too. I closed my eyes. To hear my son admit what Henry had seen with his own eyes 25 years ago, Richard's death was no accident, was to relive the burial of my firstborn all over again. The defense tried to argue Damien was under stress, manipulated by his wife, desperate to provide for his children. But there was no defense strong enough to wash away the blood of two brothers, lost, one to death, one to corruption. When the judge delivered the sentence, life in prison without parole, the room erupted in a murmur of voices. Some gasped in satisfaction, others shook their heads. I sat in silence, the words echoing in my mind like a final gavel striking down on my heart. Damien's eyes met mine only once as the guards led him away. For a fleeting second I thought I saw fear, or perhaps regret. But then he turned his head and the moment was gone. Afterward, reporters crowded me. Microphones thrust toward my face, questions hurled like stones. Do you feel justice has been served? Do you hate your son for what he did? How will you move forward after this? I couldn't answer. Words felt too small for wounds this deep. Henry shielded me with his arm, guiding me through the sea of flashing lights until we were outside breathing the cold air. That night, back in the safe house, I sat by the window and stared at the stars. Somewhere beyond those walls, beyond those prison bars, my son sat alone. And though the world saw him as a monster, my heart twisted with the unbearable truth I had given birth to him, raised him, loved him. His evil didn't erase the years of lullabies, scraped knees, and whispered prayers. It only poisoned them, turned them into ghosts that would haunt me until my last breath. Henry tried to comfort me, his hand warm on mine. "We did what we had to," he said softly. "We survived. We told the truth. Richard has peace now." I nodded, though my throat burned with unshed tears. Surviving had never felt so heavy, because survival meant carrying the memories of both my sons, the one I buried too soon, and the one still alive but lost to me forever. As weeks turned into months, life slowly regained rhythm. The town whispered less about the trial, and more about the next scandal. My flower garden grew again, blooms pushing their way through the soil, as if to remind me that life insists on going on even when our hearts resist. But every time I touched the petals, I thought of the daisies Damien once tucked into my apron when he was small. I realized then that betrayal doesn't just end with justice. It lingers, reshaping every memory, tinting even the happiest moments with sorrow. And yet, in the midst of that pain, I held on to a truth that gave me strength. Silence had nearly destroyed us once. Speaking, telling the truth, no matter how unbearable, had saved us. So now I tell my story. Not because it is easy, but because it is necessary. For Richard, whose laughter was stolen. For Henry, who carried guilt too long. And even for Damien, who lost himself to greed and lies. Because family secrets can bury us, but truth, painful, merciless truth, is the only thing that can set us free. If my story has reached you, if it has stirred something in your heart, please don't keep silent. Share this story, subscribe for more, and leave a comment with the truths you've carried. Sometimes telling them is the first step to healing.